Welcome back. In this video, we will be building our first API using Java and Spring Boot. Now, in the previous video, we've talked about Java, we've talked about Maven, we've installed Java, we've installed Maven, and we've set up Maven. We've also installed our IDE, which is the IntelliJ that we'll be using to write our code, right? Now, before we go into writing our first API, let's just first understand what Spring Boot is all about. Now, Spring Boot is a framework in Java that simplifies the development of a web application by taking care of a lot of background works. Now, it reduces the need for manual setup. Let me liken Spring Boot itself to like something like a car. A car is ready to go, right? As soon as you just turn on the key, you don't have to build the car yourself. It already has the engine, it has the wheel, and everything you need to start driving. All you need to do is just tell the car where to go, and you turn the steering, right? Now, in the same way, Spring Boot gives you a ready-made setup to build your applications so that you don't have to put everything together from scratch. You just need to focus on where you want your car to go or what you want your application to do. Spring Boot was created by the Spring team in 2014. Now, as I said earlier, the Spring itself was created 2002, right? Now, but Spring Boot itself was created in 2014. And the aim was to make it easier for developers to get up and running with building their first applications and APIs. Now, with Spring Boot, developers could build applications faster without worrying about configuration details. So it became very popular for building modern applications. So why do we even need Spring Boot? Spring Boot makes it easy to create an application. Now, without it, we would have to do a lot of configurations by ourselves, which you know takes a lot of time. It simplifies how we connect to a database, for example, how we handle web requests, and manage many other things we need in our application. Now, it also helps us to get up and running faster by providing tools to start new projects with sensible defaults. Now, let us go into creating our first Spring Boot application. To create your first API or your first Spring Boot project, just go to Google and type in Spring Initializer. The first one that comes up will be the start.spring.io. All right, that's where we want to go. Now, in the previous class, we already talked about how to create your first or your Maven project. So this kind of take that same shape, but there are certain differences in there. Is of course you would select your dependencies, and of course you would select the Spring Boot version. But let's just run through this, right? So we want to use our build tool here for this project is Maven. We're creating a Maven project, and we're also using Java as our language. Let's just take the latest Spring Boot version, for example. We're taking Spring Boot 3.4.0, right? And then our group, let's just name it our group. Again, in the previous class, we already talked about this. And then let's give it our artifact name. This name is first API, okay? You can change the description if you want, but for now, we'll just leave it as is, as default. All right, so our packaging will be in jar. If you want to create a WAR file, no problems, but I'm creating a jar file. Then you could select what Java version you want to use. Again, you could use 23, you could use 21, you could use 17, but I'm deciding to use 21, okay? So now for the dependencies, we need one dependency for this particular video, and that's the Spring Web. All right, so let's just include the Spring Web here, and then let's generate this. Now, good, it's downloaded. Let us unzip this. Awesome. So after unzipping this, the next thing is we then go import it into our IntelliJ, and that should be here. There you go. Import this, and then let's trust this. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. So in the previous class, when we were talking about Maven, if you remember, we've talked about what the structure of a Maven application looks like. It follows the same structure, right? We have the pom.xml, the source, the main, and all those stuff, right? So we also have where the main application is sitting at the moment. You see that? earlier I talked about the Spring Boot application annotation. And what the Spring Boot application does is it tells the Spring Boot to set up the application automatically, scan for components like maybe controllers, and load or configurations, right? That's what this one does, okay? Our application has loaded successfully. Okay, good. Now, creating our first API is pretty simple. Let's just do this, all right? But first, let's go into our pom.xml and look at what we have in our pom.xml. Our name is there, our group ID is there, our version is there, and our dependency seems to be okay too. Okay, good. So now let's go back to creating our first API, all right? What you need to do is just create on the new. I like to create packages for everything I do. So in this case, we are going to create a controller. So I'm just going to create a package. A package is pretty much something like a folder, right? Or a directory. All right. So I'm just going to create a controller class. Okay. I mean a controller package. Okay. So here, then I then create a class and call it let me just call it first API controller. Good. So now we have our class for our controller. Okay. Now the API we want to build, simple API. What we just want to do is we'll send our name and it should come back with hello and your name. So for example, I'm sending maybe AY as the name. I just send in hello AY. All right. But by default, if you do not supply a name, then you should come with hello world. All right. We just want to build an hello world or hello name API. All right. So let's get into it. Now, the first annotation you need here is at rest controller. I will explain what each annotation does as we go. But what at rest controller does simply is it tells Spring Boot that this class will handle all my web requests. So let us now create a method that handles our requests, everything we want to do. All right. So in this case, we want to do a public. Let's just make it public. And then we want to return a string. Okay. In the last class, we already talked about it. Now, what do we want to name our method? Let's just say hello, for example. Okay. And now here, if you remember what the requirement was it has to accept a parameter, right? And the parameter should be your name. And when you send in your name, it should come back with hello and your name. Okay. Very, very straightforward. All right. So we need something to handle the request. So, and that's where the request param comes into play. Now, there are a lot of ways. There are different ways you could do this in Spring Boot. So you could use the at request param. You could use at path variable. But in this case, we're using at request param. Now, I will tell you what each one does again. All right. So for the at request param, then we want to pass in what is the value we want to pass in? It's the name, right? So let's do a value equals, then it should be name. All right. Now, do we want to set a default value for this? Yes, we want to set a default value for it, because when you do not send your name, we just want to see hello world when nothing is supplied. Okay. So we then do a default, and then our default will be world, string world. Okay. Pretty simple. Okay. Now, what is the name of that variable we want to send? And we'll create a variable for it. A variable, string, and name. Good. Awesome. That ends that, which is good. Okay. Now, the next thing we want to do is, what do we want to return? We just want to return a string. Let's do a string.format. All right. And then we do hello. And then we could use a concatenation. We could use add. It doesn't really matter. But in my case, I'll just use the ampersand and exclamation mark. I put it in here. Okay. Good. And then I'll use a comma name. Right? So what I'm saying is it should return this name. Right? It should return this name, hello, and this name. But when the name is not supplied, just return an hello word. Pretty simple. Okay. All right. Now let us try this. Okay, there's one more thing we're missing, which is the annotation for the get. Now, there are certain HTTP requests. You could have the post, you could have the get, and you could have delete. But in this case, we are using the get. All right. So now, what's our endpoint going to be called? All right. Let's just call it hello, for example. All right. Pretty simple, pretty easy. So now let us test this. Okay. Just click on the run button. Okay. And by default, Spring Boot application runs on port 8080. It should tell you what port it's running on. Okay. Yep, this is port 8080. And as I said earlier, it's running on Tomcat because it has an embedded Tomcat. All right. So it's now to test this. I already have Postman installed. Now, if you want to download Postman, just go to Google, for example, and just type in Postman, and then you download the Postman and install it. Okay. I already have Postman installed on my local. So just download and install again, right? So on my Postman, all I need to do here is just type in my local host. If you remember, I said it's using a local host 8080, right? Let's just first do a get. Let's see what happens here. See, it's saying 404 not found just because we did not put in our hello, okay? /hello, and then you go. See, I haven't put in a name. It's coming back with hello world. Now, what happens if I do this? Say AY, for example, right? So it should come back with hello AY. All right? I hope that was clear. If you have any question, please drop your questions in the comment section. Okay? Right. Now, let's go back to what all this does. All right? Again, REST controller. At REST controller, what it does is it just tells the Spring Boot, or tells the Spring Boot that this class is marked as the web controller that handles all my HTTP requests. And what are the HTTP requests we're talking about? We're talking about the get mapping, the post mapping, the delete mapping, and the likes. All right? So when you go for interviews, some possible questions that might come up, let's just discuss them. Like, what is Spring Boot? As I said earlier, Spring Boot is a framework that simplifies the creation of a standalone application, makes our life easy. Now, how is Spring Boot, or what is Spring Boot, and how is it different from the Spring framework itself? Again, as I said earlier, Spring Boot is an extension of Spring framework, which simplifies the process of setting up and developing a Spring-based application. It makes it so easy that it uses the auto configuration, and of course, it uses the embedded Tomcat. If you remember from when we were running the application, you would see that it's spinning up a Tomcat application, which is the web server that it is running on. Another one is, what is the purpose of the Add Spring Boot application annotation, right? As I said earlier, the Add Spring Boot application annotation combines three things: the add configuration, the add enable auto configuration, the add component scan. And what these three does is, of course, the add configuration marks the class as the source of a bin definition. The enable configuration enables the Spring Boot auto configuration features, and the component scan scans the package and subpackage for Spring Boot components. All right, we'll get into that in details as we move on. Now, another one is, what is the at-rest controller, or what is the REST controller in Spring Boot? Now, the REST controller combines the add controller and the response body. As I said earlier, the REST controller is the annotation that marks the class as a web controller, and it tells that particular class that it would handle all the HTTP requests. From the previous code we wrote, we have the get mapping, the delete mapping, and put mapping, for example, and there's also the patching, right? So it is used to create a RESTful web service and returns objects directly, such as maybe JSON and XML. All right. So some of the Spring Boot annotations we have. These are some of the Spring Boot annotations we have. As I said earlier, you have the HTTP request annotations, which is get mapping, post mapping, put mapping, delete mapping, and of course you have the patch mapping, right? Now you have the Spring Boot annotation, the Spring Boot application annotation, this REST controller, the path variable, request parameter, auto wired, at service. These are all annotations we would use as we go on. So this series will be a long series where we'd create microservices, use Docker, and all those fun stuff to create microservices and API. Okay? I hope I've been able to make a lot of sense here. If you have questions, please put your questions in the comment section. Once again, I am super excited to be your instructor for this journey of building excellence. Please subscribe, leave your comments, click the notification button so that you'll be able to see our new videos, and most importantly, share with your friends. And I'll see you in the next video.